I was just writing case studies.
I'm Elizabeth Rosini, Interim Director of the American Academy in Rome, and it is my great pleasure to introduce you formally to our new colleague, Marla Stone. Marla is the newly arrived Andrew W. Mellon Humanities Professor here at the Academy. She comes to us from Occidental College in Los Angeles, where she is Professor of Modern European History and where she has been teaching since 1994. Marla's work focuses on modern Italy, and in particular, the history of fascism, authoritarianism, and genocide. We at the Academy have already had a glimpse of how richly her particular lens of study will impact our experiences of Rome this year. A morning walk of barely 3 blocks around our own neighborhood helped us begin to unpack the messages, intended and reimagined, of monuments across time. We learned how the ground beneath us continues to tell stories, examining connections between the ancient, the Baroque, the 19th century, the mid-20th century, and the present, and considering the powerful connection between the art of the monument and the histories we tell. Like her Occidental College students, we are and will be the lucky recipients of Marla's gifts as a teacher this year. Marla's impressive body of work emphasizes the relationship between ideology, culture, and the state in the 20th century. She has published on a variety of topics in European history, including Italian fascist cultural politics, anti-communism, the contemporary far right in Europe, Italian Holocaust memory culture, and the role of the American media in forging public consent for NATO intervention in Bosnia. In addition to Italian history, she has also published and taught in the field of genocide studies and spent several summers in the late 90s teaching at the University of Tuzla in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And if you want some inspiring stories of her time at the AAR, ask her to tell you about the reporting she did on the war in Bosnia that year. Marla's work frequently engages the arts as well. She has studied fascist cultures of display, exhibitions of Italian soldier artists in the first half of the 20th century, and the transformation of the Venice Biennale under fascism. Marla Stone is the author of numerous books and articles, including her first, The Patron State, Culture and Politics in Fascist Italy, which won the Howard R. Marara Prize for Best Book in Italian History from the Society for Italian Historical Studies in 1999. Other books include The Fascist Revolution, Society, Politics, and Culture in Mussolini's Italy, and When the Wall Came Down, Responses to German Reunification, co-edited with Harold James. Marla has contributed to many essay collections and has published articles in many journals, including, but not limited to, the Journal of Contemporary History, the Journal of Hate Studies, the Journal of Modern Italian Studies, and Memoria e Ricerca, to name just a few. She is currently working on 2 big projects, a book entitled The Enemy, The Politics and Propaganda of Anti-Communism in Italy, and an edited volume with Brian J. Griffith, Red Spain and Fascist Prison. Marla is the recipient of numerous honors. In addition to being a Rome Prize Fellow in Post-Classical Humanistic Studies in 1996, she has in recent years been a fellow at the European University Institute, the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and at Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University, from which she had previously received her MA and her PhD in history. Her research has also been supported by the Gladys Kriegel-Delmas Foundation, the Italian Academy at Columbia University, and the Wilsonian Foundation. Recently, Marla completed a term as president of the Society of Italian Historical Studies, and she serves as board president for the American Civil Liberties Union Federation of Southern California. I could go on, but I do want you to hear from Marla. So let's move to her talk. Acts of Self-Representation, Nazi Fascist Wartime Cultural Diplomacy.
Well, first, thank you, Elizabeth, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm really touched that you mentioned the Bosnian part. And at some point, I would love to talk about coming from war-torn Bosnia and showing up here anchor since 1995. But that's for another day. I want to thank everyone here present in person very much for coming today, fellows and staff of the American Academy, and then also whomever might be zooming in from outside. So with that, let me turn to the talk today. As Italian fascist and German nationalist socialist regimes moved towards a political and military alliance in the mid-1930s in the wake of the Ethiopian and Spanish Civil Wars, cultural diplomacy became an increasingly central tool in selling the partnership to their respective populations. With the signing of the Pact of Steel in May 1939, the two dictatorships formalized their military pact to, quote, work side by side and join forces for the security of their living space. Despite the rhetoric of mutuality, the already obvious subordination of fascist Italy to Nazi Germany and the widespread Italian opposition to the alliance at the level of the fascist leadership and at the level of Italian populace infiltrated all aspects of the relationship. With the tensions within it and its ultimate failure, Nazi fascist cultural diplomacy of the years 1939 to 1942 offer a lens into the power dynamics and the contrasting cultural ideologies of the two regimes. Accelerating in the months leading up to the signing of the Pact of Steel, the fascist government and party mobilized culture in a variety of forms to introduce intellectuals, cultural elites, and the larger public to the coming Nazi fascist new order. So you get in these years, 38, 39, a real flurry of collaborative film productions, exhibitions, conferences, cultural exchanges that brought together Italian and German intellectuals, artists, and writers. All of this in the hope that it might forge a common ground and inculcate the priorities of fascist-dominated Europe. Axis joint cultural initiatives were very creative, and they included magazines such as Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, and international exhibitions such as the 1942 Venice Biennale Mostra del Cinema, which was renamed the Italian-German Film Festival. Italian fascists at home supplemented joint Axis projects with a domestic cultural program to sell the Axis alliance to the public. So you had a special center for the study and activity of the new order, which offered lectures and publications and film screenings, all selling the glories of what would come with an Axis victory, and all selling fear against the enemies of the Axis. Now, we all know, or many of us know, that Italian fascist and German National Socialist cultural approaches to culture were conflicting. They differed on the ideal vision between artists and the state. They differed on the state's official aesthetic choices, particularly towards modernism and the avant-garde. But where they agreed was on cultural forms. And they particularly agreed that the exhibition was a great way to sell a political idea or a policy program of the moment. The exhibition, a flexible, mobile, modern, and potentially total work of art, was an essential tool that could fill an array of functions. So both regimes put exhibitions at the center of their cultural crusades, right? The possibilities embedded in the form, its ability to contain and propagandize any message, to direct the gaze, to control the narrative, and to regulate emotions, made it a ubiquitous presence and a defining aspect of the Nazi and fascist cultural imaginary. Moreover, exhibitions offered a physical meeting place and a mixing point for cultural producers and consumers. The offices of the party and the government already by 1939 had used exhibitions to introduce a range of policies and initiatives from autarky to empire to sports and so on. And we know the Nazis infamously used exhibitions to promulgate their anti-modern, anti-Semitic policies. Famous Degenerate Art Exhibition 1937 and the less famous, but I would argue equally important, Soviet Paradise Exhibition of 1942. Now, while historians, art historians, architectural historians, myself included, have looked at these large national exhibitions, the exhibitions on which the two regimes collaborated and were much smaller in scale and which traveled between the Axis powers during the war have not been studied. Okay, there's the cover and poster of the exhibition of National Socialism that I'm going to turn to. So today I'm going to talk about two jointly promoted exhibitions created with the goal of introducing their respective populations to the ideological priorities of the other. The first, the National Socialist Exhibition of 1939, and the second is the exhibition of Italian soldier artists of 1942 and 1943. Taken together, these reveal both consensus around the power of culture to mobilize, but deep differences around race, ideology, and religion. In other words, the small-scale collaborations I'm going to talk about now expose the limits, aesthetic and political, of the Nazi-fascist collaboration. The exhibition of National Socialism celebrated the Pact of Steel. The second exhibition of Italian soldier artists circulated across Axis-occupied Europe, a display of art purportedly produced by Italian artists on the battlefield. A little bit more about that later. But the point being that these were both attempts at self-representation at two crucial turning points. The spring of 1939, the moment, we can look at that, but back to that. The spring of 1939, the moment of greatest shared confidence in the possibility of a future fascist-controlled Europe. And the second one took place in late 1942 and early 1943, when military defeats challenged that vision. Go to the 1939 map. So this is Europe in 1939. While foreign ministers von Ribbentrop of Germany and Ciano of Italy negotiated the military alliance, the two nations' ministries of propaganda agreed on the exchange of, quote, political and documentary exhibitions. The goal, they explicitly said, was to make a spiritual contribution to the strengthening of the Axis by building more intimate and knowledge-based relations. The two propaganda ministries, there we have the two propaganda ministries. We have Joseph Goebbels and the Podesta Bologna, who organized the exhibit. And the two propaganda ministries organized the exhibition, and Mussolini's office approved the written outline and selected the dignitaries to attend. The director of the Institute for German Cultural and Economic Propaganda curated it, and the Italian Ministry of Popular Culture oversaw the logistics. And the Ente Provinciale Turismo paid for the show's installation and traveling costs. At the time of the signing of the Pact of Steel and this exhibition, the Axis powers were ascendant and revisionist powers. So Germany had taken over Austria in the Anschluss in March 1938, had occupied the Sudetenland in October 1938, and absorbed the rest of Czechoslovakia the month March 1939 that this exhibition had opened. Fascist Italy had consolidated its empire in Africa and would soon invade Albania. So if the National Socialist Exhibition opened in a moment of celebration for the two fascist revolutions, it was also a moment when the fascist leadership needed most to sell an unpopular military and political alliance. At the inauguration, Renato Ricci, then Undersecretary of the Ministry of Corporations, cut the ribbon. And this was the same day as the opening of the Bologna Fair, May 14, 1939, and the Duke of Pistoia contributed an enthusiastic Heil Hitler. Cesare Colliva, who was a huge booster of this exhibition, the Podesta of Bologna, then read congratulatory telegrams exchanged between himself and Joseph Goebbels. They were very proud of the telegrams, and they featured on the first page of the catalog. Okay, and here's the pavilion. The exhibition pavilion had a stripped down, unadorned brick rationalist facade, crowned only by sans serif lettering declaring Mostra, Socialism. The freestanding pavilion was flanked by a sea of Nazi flags and eagles. Yeah, there we go, flags and eagles. And by locating the exhibition at the heart of the annual Bologna Fair, and I think it's really important to keep in mind that these summer fairs are huge tourist attractions. Right? There's a zillion things going on around this little pavilion. So by locating it in the heart of the annual fair, the organizers had hoped that the introduction of Nazism would be a natural stop for fairgoers. The exhibition was divided into 3 sections among 7 rooms, and the overarching narrative was Hitler's and Nazism's struggle and rise to power as the nation's great act of redemption. It was curated with display cases and wall installations, and each room pivoted around a binary of before and after the Nazi Revolution. Okay. This is the Salon of Honor. As in many fascist and Nazi exhibitions, visitors entered through a solemn Salon of Honor dedicated to the leader. In this case, the Salon of Honor introduced Italians to the cult of Hitler. Here tourists saw a bust of Hitler flanked by 2 titles, Fuhrer of the German People, that's the one, Fuhrer of the German People and Creator of Greater Germany. In this room hung a large map of the Reich in its newly extended form, the assertion of the Greater Reich, and the dominating figure of Hitler as leader and conqueror. This established Nazi power from the first room, and it was also, I would argue, a reminder of Italy's growing subordination to Germany. Following the Salon of Honor, there was a large room dedicated to Hitler's World War I combat experience, the beer hall putsch, and the writing of Mein Kampf. So this is a photo from 1923. Okay. By linking World War I to the beer hall putsch and to Mein Kampf, the exhibition conflated the national struggle with the Nazi struggle, making Hitler's fate synonymous with Germany's. The narrative that the Nazi seizure of power was the natural outcome of the national tragedy of World War I would have been familiar to Italian audiences, because that was the way the fascist regime interpreted history, that there had been this loss and violence and humiliation in World War I, and the fascists and Nazis had come to save the nation. So according to the exhibition, Hitler's triumph resolved all the tensions of the national past and embodied unified and glorious future ahead. The wall-sized photo of Hitler, dating from his 1923 trial, occupied the center wall with the words "Faith in the Future" next to his image. He was flanked by a text celebrating his brief spell in Landsberg prison, and then the birth of the political doctrine. Here's Mein Kampf, Faith in the Future. And then you see La Mia Lotta, Mein Kampf. Okay, and then there's the statement of the political faith. Now, what jumps out immediately is that they are being honest and forward about what they believe in. They were not hiding any of it for the Italian public. So The statement of faith declares National Socialism lives in the belief that blood and race are the eternal forces which maintain the life and survival of the people. On an adjacent wall, continuing the thought, hung the political oath. National Socialism acknowledges that blood and race are eternal forces. So it's repeated over and over. Proceeding from this knowledge, is the statement that continues, is that National Socialism intends to maintain and strengthen the natural energies and traditional values of the Nordic Aryan race. By the time that Italian audiences would have faced that assertion of radical race ideology, fascist Italy's racial laws, which themselves declared Italians Mediterranean Aryans and excluded Jews from most professions and schools, forbid intermarriage, and circumscribed the economic life of Italian Jews, those laws have been enforced for about 8 months at this point. So while Italians would have been familiar with biological racism, the vehemence and, I would argue, violent implications of the Nazi birth would have been disorienting to many Italians. The following rooms focused on the Nazi reorganization of society, its social programs, its demographic battle, its 5-year plan for industry and agriculture. These rooms describe the social services and organizations created by the regime, from the Hitler Youth to the German Labor Front. So this mix of kind of radical race ideology with kind of practical policies, but always in a binary, always a before and after. So photos juxtapose what it considered the social conflict, poverty, misogynation, and moral turpitude of the Weimar Republic, which they conveyed through photos of clubs and cabarets and caricatures of Jews and Africans. They compared this caricature of the Weimar Republic with the order and cleanliness of Germany after Hitler, represented by blonde youth in Hitler Youth uniforms and the like. Here we have on display the healthy German family. The purported conspiracy of Jews and Marxists, the repeated references to the Red Terror, which the Nazis had defeated, informed each policy presented. Now, in the most unsettling aspect of the exhibition, the National Socialist exhibition openly celebrated the Nazi eugenics crusade against the disabled, those with mental illness, and the chronically ill. It's very hard to see in these pictures, but there's lists on that wall of the people who can be legally sterilized, and then in the front is this model of the healthy German family. The room dedicated to eugenics listed in large letters the conditions under which German citizens could be legally sterilized, including congenital idiocy, schizophrenia, hereditary epilepsy, hereditary blindness, manic depression, deafness, physical deformities, and acute alcoholism. The celebration of forced sterilization for a broad range of medical and mental health conditions, I would think, would have shocked many Italians and certainly ran counter to Catholic sensibilities, the Catholic sensibilities of most Italians. A wall panel in the same room carried on about the anti-Semitic crusade and talked about sort of before and after the Jewish problem, with a declaration that Jews had infiltrated the life of the nation with ever-increasing levels of race mixing, and that afterward, in Nazi Germany, there would be a separation of the Jewish element and the elimination of Judaism from the life of the German people. So they are not being shy about their intentions. Only in the final room, only as visitors exited, was there an acknowledgement of fascist Italy. So this exhibition that was designed to celebrate the alliance does not mention Italy till the very end. And this single small room centers on a wall-sized photograph of Mussolini and Hitler and a friendly handshake, nearly eye to eye, above which ran the phrase, "The Berlin-Rome axis guarantees order and peace in Europe." The body language of the two leaders conveys friendship through Hitler's grasping of Mussolini's hand and collaboration through the way they gazed directly at each other and away from the audience. The aesthetic of the National Socialist exhibition, with its flat wall displays, its unadorned graphics, devoid of any accompanying artwork, was shockingly retrograde and static, and it was an explicit rejection of the exhibition innovations of the 20s and 30s, right? Including the by then standard use of photo montage. It also rejected the standard design features of fascist exhibitions such as plastica, murales, and three-dimensional constructions that were built out of the wall. It did not have the monumental dynamism found of rationalist exhibition design found in many exhibitions of the 1930s. This is just a little itinerary of where the exhibition ended up going. And then just as an aside, an example of a kind of dynamic wall display from the exhibition of the Fascist Revolution, the most famous of the fascist exhibitions with its rationalist facade. I won't linger on it, but one could say a lot about that. Okay, so on the closing of the exhibit, Cesare Colliva, the booster of the exhibition that I mentioned, really thought this was going to be a great thing for Bologna, declared that there had been an attendance of 300,000 people. Sounds a little much, but this is what he asserted, and it was in the newspapers. However, the archival record loudly and a bit mysteriously rejects Colliva's assertion, suggesting instead conflicts, ambivalence, and failure on both sides. Colliva's attendance figures must be read against the fact that the National Socialist exhibition, as I mentioned, opened within several much larger fairs, of which it was only a small part. So that 300,000 figure were all the people who went to, try out the wine and the food and look at the agricultural products. And as we know from fascist exhibitions, cultural events in general, significant train fares were offered for all of these official events. If you said you were going to go to this fair or this exhibition, you could buy your ticket at a discount, and then you would just show it and it would get stamped. And then you would also get a little booklet giving you discounts to the theater or to special restaurants. So there was a lot of sort of incentive to mobilize people to come to these events. And so then the numbers don't become really an indication of interest. Even prior to its inauguration in Bologna, the National Socialist exhibition's original itinerary of 12 stops was reduced to 5. And then in the end, it only opened in Bologna, Padua, and San Remo in May, June, and July 1939. I have not been able to find in the archive or in any of the press coverage why the other iterations of the traveling exhibition never opened. This remains a mystery. And in addition to the cancellation of the vast majority of the itinerary, tensions flared over which officials would attend the inaugurations. Nobody seemed to want to go to this. Colliva had invited Mussolini. He said he was way too busy. There were invitations sent to the Minister of Popular Culture, Dino Fiera. He also was very busy. And in the end, Renato Ricci, Undersecretary of the Ministry of Corporations, was sent around to these 3 openings. So no high-ranking Nazis wanted to go either. And you see this in the correspondence, and a lot of irritation on the Italian side about why the Germans won't attend their own exhibition. And then they fought over who was going to pay the customs fees for bringing this material. The propaganda ministers of Italy and Germany had intended the National Socialist exhibition to build Italian support for the alliance. But in the form it appeared, it can be interpreted instead as a German attempt to intimidate Italian audiences with a show of economic, military, and racial strength. the emphasis on the total coordination of German society under Nazi rule, the explicit language of racial corruption and cleansing, the obvious marginalization of fascist Italy from the narrative of expansion and war, all speak to a power play on the part of German organizers. So rather than a celebration of the Axis, which you saw only referred to in the final room, the exhibition delivered a message about the power and dynamics of Nazi domination within the partnership. In the end, the startling fact that the exhibition's itinerary was cut from 12 to 3 cities, and that the Italian equivalent proposed in the initial documents never took place. All of this suggests that Italian audiences got the message and did not like it. Nazi-fascist cultural exchange and soft diplomacy continued as the two powers fought side by side on battlefields in Africa, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front. So now we're jumping to the summer of 1942. In the summer of 1942, the propaganda office of the Italian Army, an odd office to design an exhibition under the leadership of wounded World War I veteran, Army Lieutenant, and I would say a very entrepreneurial cultural bureaucrat, Francesco Sapori, came up with this idea to create a traveling exhibition of art produced by Italian soldiers. Its explicit purpose was to use the work of artist soldiers at the front to expose audiences in Germany and other Axis allied nations to the humanity and civilizing nature of fascism at war. So here is the German edition, right? This is the edition that was used for Munich, Berlin, and Vienna. Here is the inauguration in Rome. I want to turn actually first. There was a significant amount of cultural production around this exhibition. So they minted medallions to be given out to the artists who won. So you have this commemoration with the XX for the 20th year of the fascist regime. And then on this side, you have the slogan, credere, obbedire, combattere, vincere. They added that. The original was believe, obey, fight, and then for the war they added win. The explicit I say this way, the explicit purpose was to use the work of artist soldiers at the front to expose audiences in Germany to the humanity. The argument for Italian cultural superiority was a central plank in the Nazi-fascist relationship, which had begun in the 1930s as fascist bureaucrats pushed a line about Italian cultural superiority based in the Roman and Renaissance legacy, and that fascism would give a more spiritual and deeper understanding of European culture to the Axis. After opening in Rome at the Palace of Exhibitions on Via Nazionale, it's still there, it's still an exhibition space. The exhibition traveled to Berlin, Munich, Vienna between October and March 1943, and then to Budapest and Bucharest in May and June of 1943. So as the Axis was losing and losing bad and retreating fast from Eastern Europe, they were continuing to circulate this exhibition. The exhibition presented a prescribed, sanitized, and compensatory vision of victory and sacrifice on the front lines. As a display of the successes and humanity of the Italian army, at a time when neither existed in reality, the show reveals the role that the regime hoped to carve out for itself in the new Europe as culturally superior and as the explicit descendant of the most important European cultural traditions. The show featured paintings, drawings, etchings, and sculpture by conscripts and volunteers, those with international reputation, and those with regional careers. Altogether, there were 797 works of art and 126 soldier artists. The opening in Rome that we saw an image of in the summer of 1942 included an inauguration by King Victor Emmanuel in a solemn ceremony on the steps of the Palace of Exhibitions. 2 days later, Mussolini attended and celebrated the success of the exhibition and announced that it would travel Nazi-occupied Europe. The media visibility given to this exhibition, in contrast to the one I just spoke about, as well as the high-level inauguration by the king and Mussolini's appearance a few days later, all highlight continued faith in the power of culture. I want to stress that, right? That as the war is becoming more and more untenable, they are putting large amounts of money into these exhibitions. The censored press claims that 100,000 people in Rome visited at its first stop. So arguing for Italy's unique contribution to the exhibition of Italian soldier artists was meant at this pivotal moment in the war for human domination to distinguish Italy from its German allies and also to convince the Third Reich of Italy's civilizing mission. The exhibition catalog and the press coverage repeatedly stressed the unity of art and war and the power and humanity of Italy's military. The catalog introduction focused on a long history in Italy of the coexistence in the same person of the artist and the soldier, and of art in the service of war, from Trajan's Column to Andrea Mantegna's St. George the Avenger. We have St. George. I'm not quite there yet, but the emphasis on Italy's military prowess and civilizing mission reflected Mussolini's determination to prove Italy's special contribution. So as the exhibition toured, the Italian forces on the Eastern Front had grown to 235,000. And Italian and German forces there renewed a joint offensive in the fall of 1942, an offensive that within months was stalled. So as the exhibition moved from Germany to Hungary and Romania, there was the massive retreat from the Eastern Front. The German 6th Army collapsed in February 1943, surrendering to the Soviets, and the Italian lines in the East collapsed, bringing the death of 30,000 Italian soldiers and the capture of another 54,000. The propaganda office of the Army coordinated the selection of artists with the Union of the Fine Arts. We also have to keep in mind, this is an artistic culture that is very much structured by the regime. So you had to join the artists' union to even be available for an exhibition like this. In many cases, cultural bureaucrats went to artists that they wanted to participate and said to them, which battlefield would you like to go to? And then would send them there for a short time, and they would do some drawings, and they would come back. The art of the exhibition came in a range of styles, albeit more limited than the official art of the 1920s and 30s. And in its promotion of art that stressed power and spirituality of Italy's military effort, artists depended mostly on legible and realistic aesthetics. So the styles ranged from illustrationists to attempts at impressionism or expressionism, to naive and folk styles, to neoclassical and Novecento styles. Many of the works connected fascist Italy to imperial Rome. And we saw this when we went to the mausoleum here on the Gianicolo, employing something called the stile littorio, a fascist imitation of Roman art. Fascism's dependence on the Roman past as a source of legitimacy and inspiration meant that Roman-inspired art, particularly the public arts of statuary, mosaics, and bas-relief, were a recurring element of official culture, and in this instance, again telegraphed to the Nazis fascism's direct lineage from ancient Rome. So this is Spirit Builders at the front, and it's pretty much a copy of Trajan's column, but with soldiers in fascist uniform. References to Rome's achievements and universality can be seen in works such as this one and also in Departure of the Legionary. This work here combines Roman statuary styles with the exhibition's central theme of the humanity of Italian soldiers. The statue shows a legionary in uniform with his kit and rifle at his feet, lifting his toddler son for a farewell kiss. The material and the pose of the figures harkens back to classical statuary, and the scene evokes the tenderness of the Italian family and a father's devotion both to home and to the patria. Two levels of fatherhood. For the German, Austrian, and Hungarian audiences who attended in late 1942 and 43, the exhibition was meant to be a twofold lesson in the discipline and skill of the Italian military, and as I said, its humanitarianism and its civilization. So while battlefield landscapes and combat scenes predominated, so did depictions of fellowship and camaraderie among the soldiers at the front. There were emotional scenes like this of soldiers departing from home and family, and depictions of the good works and charity of Italian soldiers. The fraternal bonding of soldiers at the front, the military success of the war, represented through scenes of forward motion, depictions of military technology, and of bombardments. And I think we can tell from this piece, Storm Attack, that a lot of the art is not what we would consider particularly skilled or good art. Battlefield and military camp scenes emphasize orderliness, conviction, and unity among the Italian armed forces. Here's a portrait of a soldier and a painter. The representations of the Italian military on the offensive, of course, mock the reality of Italy's rescue in the Balkans and North Africa and its growing dependence on Nazi Germany. Mussolini's declaration of La Guerra Fascista and his fantasies of transforming Italians into a warrior race had proven false in the actual military campaigns, making it all the more important that they remained alive in paint, pencil, ink, and watercolor. Technology often stood in as another sign of Italian military competence and for Italy's value as an ally. From late 1944, in anticipation of hostilities and with the knowledge of Italy's lack of preparation for a multi-front war, fascist propaganda underscored Italy's supposed technological advances. So there were a lot of images of planes and tanks and parachute squads. So again, a compensatory stress. The idea that the representation of technology could stand in for the actual technology. Now, Catholic themes, I jumped over a little bit, also predominated and demonstrated the piety of the Italian military. So there was a diffusion of saints, angels, and scenes of mass and last rites. Antonio Sant'Agata, who we see here in his drawing of St. George, patron of the cavalry, did a series of three. He also did St. Martin and St. Barbara of the artillery. So this is a compelling example of the mobilization of Catholic iconography and its imbrication into fascist visual culture. Sant'Agata was a Genovese painter and a central figure in the fascist art world, fascist official culture. He had a lot of public commissions, he did a lot of mosaics and frescoes, including some in Rome in the Casa Madre dei Mutilati. So here we have the fascistized saint. St. George, the early militant early Christian martyr, is associated with victory over the barbarians. So here have a St. George in uniform of a fascist legionary standing over the defeated monster. So he is slain, in the original story, slain the dragon to save the king's daughter and return converted to the infidels. Here he protects Italy as it battles Bolshevik barbarism. Here, St. George slays the forces of evil, heralding the fascist new order. We have the horse looking towards the future. The historical references are obvious. So here we have Raphael with St. George and the dragon and the white horse again. And then here we have St. Barbara. St. Barbara, another early Christian martyr and one of the 14 holy helpers and patron saint of artillerymen, military engineers, and others who work with explosives. Here she stands in front of a tank, surrounded by artillery shells, and bears a halo of light and smoke. She holds a castellated church, and in the background, a village burns. Her martyrology associates her also with the crushing of infidels. And what is coded in all of this, the infidel by this point in the war, is the Bolshevik angle. It is about the Eastern Front, and so much fascist propaganda is about the need to destroy the Bolsheviks in order to save the Italian home front. So her martyrology also associates her with the crushing of infidels, and here she sanctifies the destruction necessary to destroy the barbarian threat. In addition, her original martyrology presents her as a symbol of the coming new church. So here she's re-embedded as a symbol of the coming fascist new order. Here we have the historical reference to a Renaissance St. Barbara. Now, this becomes the flashpoint, right? The Reich Ministry of Popular Enlightenment did not like all the Catholic work at all and objected to the preponderance of religious themes and actually demanded that those paintings be taken out when the exhibition traveled to the Reich. However, they were put back in when they went to Hungary and Romania. So they were excluded from Munich, Berlin, and Warsaw, and then were welcomed as a very popular aspect of this show, originally in Italy, and then in Hungary and Romania. In Budapest, the patron saints that we just saw occupied the first rooms. And in Budapest, critics celebrated the Italian soldier artists who put themselves in the service of sacred art. Now, images of the enemy figured prominently in the exhibition, with many depictions of captured British, Balkan, and Russian soldiers. British, Balkan, Russian, and African soldiers. By 1942, as I said, the ferocity and barbarism of the enemies of the Axis replaced any positive explanations of what victory would bring. So as the military campaigns failed, and as Italy's subordination to Nazi Germany grew more obvious, the civilization-destroying qualities of fascism's enemies became the central explanation for why we fight. The war increasingly represented as a clash of civilizations between the virile fascist warrior descended from the Romans and the racially degenerate and weak who would destroy Italian civilization, the Catholic Church, and the Italian family. The show portrayed the enemy after capture, disarmed, without uniform, and no longer a threat. In a series of 21 pencil and watercolor images, Fulvio Bianconi, a 27-year-old lance corporal in the artillery, composed portraits of Australian, South African, Indian, Serb, and Sudanese prisoners of war. Here we have his Sudanese prisoner, shows a Sudanese POW in profile, bearded, and with an exaggeratedly large cap, which makes him seem small and thin. The image has an anthropological quality of observation of the other, and I would argue combines the colonial racist gaze with a gaze of fascist domination. Now, if the Catholic themes represented a challenge to Italy's Nazi allies, the presence of work expressing racial stereotypes, particularly ones tapping into Nazi ideas about Judeo-Bolshevism, about the joint degeneracy of Jews and Bolsheviks, and the idea that all Jews were Bolsheviks and all Bolsheviks were Jews, represented a shared priority and was received quite well in the right. Stoking fears about Russian primitiveness, immutable biological flaws, and more recent tropes about Bolshevik barbarism and immorality, official representations of the communist enemy put forward a racially degenerate, godless peril from the East, bent on destruction and desecration. So nowhere was the racialized enemy depicted as vulgarly and violently as in a series of ink drawings by Ezio Castellucci. These are drawings from the Eastern Front that give aesthetic form to ideas about communist Russian racial degeneracy. Castellucci renders the soldiers of the Red Army as subhuman, animal-like objects in an unforgiving landscape of violence. In requisition, we see a Red Army soldier pillaging the hut of a terrified peasant woman. Surrounded by the furniture he's ransacked, he heads for the door, grasping his spoils. The peasant woman cowers next to an icon of the Virgin, which through the use of shading becomes the central object that we see in the room. From opposite sides of the drawing, the ghoulish, smirking soldier threatens the viewer, while the peasant woman looks desperately in the other direction. Between them is a covered corpse. Is it the woman's murdered husband? The soldier with his pointy ears and sunken and beady eyes in his plunder and possible rape of this poor, pious woman becomes demonic. Castellucci's portrait of a Soviet POW, ironically titled Comrade, shows a clumsy, lumbering figure with raised arms, close-set eyes, and an overall distorted physiognomy, and a confused gaze designed to signal the supposed racial inferiority, racial and intellectual inferiority of the Soviet forces. Now, my last image is an intriguing one because I think it runs counter to everything I've just said, that I would read this as an image of resistance and rebellion, right? It seems to me to be clearly referring to Goya's 3rd of May, 1908, and we have the central figure, the one who's being repressed in the rebellion looking out at us, right? And the soldiers who are doing the repression, the execution, have their backs turned to us. So I think this is an image that we could read against the grain. In contrast to the cancellation of the vast, in contrast to the cancellation of the vast majority of the itinerary of the exhibition of National Socialism in 1939, the first exhibition of Italian social artists continued its travels well into the summer of 1943. As I said, despite the collapses on all sides, positively received in Munich, Berlin, Vienna. The Office of the Chief of Staff in the Military wrote to Mussolini in April 1943 to report that the show in Germany had attracted a lively and attentive interest with a considerable number of visitors, all of whom left moved and full of appreciation. In Budapest, officials and reviewers also reported large audiences and gave positive reviews. So apparently, a vision of the Axis front lines as places with kind and pious soldiers pining for their families at home and equipped with the most modern and effective weaponry was something audiences in Germany, Hungary, Italy, and Romania wanted to believe in, and the Italian military gave it to them. This episode, one of the last in Nazi fascist cultural diplomacy, achieved its goal notwithstanding the fact that the goal itself had become at this point irrelevant. So in a rapidly changing environment of ascendancy and defeat between 1939 and 1943, these two exhibitions offered their audiences alternate realities. While the first labored to convince Italians of the advantages of an alliance with Nazi Germany, the second represents the fascist regime's desperate attempt to assure the public at home and abroad of its capabilities and its humanity. And their promoters hoped that the National Socialist exhibition would forge consent for the war alongside Germany, and that the exhibition of Italian soldier artists would convince a restive population against all evidence that victory was imminent. Moreover, these exhibitions tell us in the end about the deep faith both regimes had in cultural diplomacy and exhibitions in particular. But faith and funding were not enough, and in the end, these exhibitions reinforced the cruel and violent reality they were supposed to deny. A very, very quick postscript. The military found some of the images. I thought this whole thing had burned down in Bucharest in the summer of 1943. And in 2017, they found some and they hung them in this small exhibition space in the stadium of Domitian, and put it up with no context and no explanation, like here are some interesting images of Italians at war. So raising issues about conflicted and problematic Italian memory of World War II. Thank you. I am happy to take questions. Okay, I'll start in the back. Tina?
One of the things that I found very striking was the similarity between some of the tactics that the CIA used and their PSYOP project to promulgate notions of American freedom using experimental art and global exhibitions. And I was just wondering if there's any evidence for the CIA studying these tactics and taking inspiration from them.
Well, it's a great question. I think that there is deep faith in cultural diplomacy, right? In many, many instances. I mean, the one sort of CIA connection I don't get to here, but after the war, the CIA did use a number of fascist wartime anti-communist films for the 1948 election to get people to vote against the left. So there's a through line there. Grace?
Yeah, I was really intrigued by the last set of images that you showed us of the 3rd of May and the drawing.
Yeah.
This is me coming from ignorance. I don't know that much about Goya's painting. Can you talk more about this connection?
I do not know a ton about Goya. Is there some here? Well, the context is the Spanish rebellion against Napoleon, if that's what you meant. But in terms of the history of the painting, it's in the Prado.
Oh, I do mean just like generally, like what is it about?
Oh, I'm sorry. So there was a nationalist rebellion in Spain against the Napoleonic occupation, and this is the execution of some of the rebels. Yes. Did you want to add? Yeah.
Okay. Just a curiosity. Is there any futurist painters?
Well, hold that. I thought that someone wanted to say something about Goya. About Goya?
Yeah. Primarily to me, Goya painted about the suffering and the horrors of war. And it was always from that perspective. He never glorified it.
Mm-hmm.
It was always on the side of the guy with his.
Yeah. So that's a great point, right? And that's what I found so odd about this image. Yes.
I think it's interesting too, because in the Goya there's this sort of clear reference to the sort of Christian martyr imagery once again. And I know that you had been speaking about it in some of the other examples from this exhibit. I mean, it's just an interesting parallel, that sort of Catholic Christian martyr.
Yeah, right. And the way the figures, right, are standing is so similar. It's such a reference. Sorry.
But it could be that we immediately think of the Goya because it is so famous. And it seems implausible that one could draw or even exhibit this as in favor of the army, of the soldiers, and not the civilians. However, in the Goya painting, they are shooting at defenseless people. In the drawing, they are not shooting, at least not shooting yet. You see what I mean?
Right,
So
right.
I think maybe, and they are holding their hands
Yeah.
so I don't know, because it does seem strange. I agree with you, but maybe.
But I think that our sympathy is supposed to go to the figure that's looking at us, right?
I would say so too, but I mean, I'm not sure we can just trust our natural relationship with that. I would have a question if I use the opportunity.
Gracie,
No, of course.
was that your whole question?
Yeah, thank you.
We had something about futurism and then
Right,
I'll come back. Yes?
Oh, no, no. That's okay. I was wondering if it's any futurists.
So it's a good question. No, they're not. Surprisingly, right after this period of aero cultura and all the depictions of the dynamism of war and bombardment.
Celebrating colonial power.
Yes, yeah, it's a standard of fascist culture, but it is not in this exhibition, at least not in the Catalogue. Gardner?
Yeah, not far from that. You mentioned in passing the infamous, as you said, Artistical Kunst exhibition, which was a relatively rare case of defaming exhibition. It was meant to downgrade what was exhibited and not to laud it. Was there anything comparable in the Italian fascist cultural policy? Was exhibition ever used as a means to attack what was exhibited and defame it rather than?
It's a great question, right? Because there's so much of that in the Nazi case. And,
Yeah.
you know, this exhibit of the Soviet Paris that I'm particularly interested in right now from 1943 is it's very violent. It's all about the horrors of the Soviet system, images of starving children and the like. I cannot think of anything equivalent in the Italian case. There was an attempt at a degenerate by a faction of anti-modernist bureaucrats in the late 30s. They attempted to put on an Italian version of the degenerate art exhibition, and the futurists actually mobilized against it, and it did not happen. Any other questions?
Maybe the answer is it just doesn't exist, but I was thinking when you talked about the Bologna exhibition and that you didn't find any, what I'm wondering is if you found any reactions to any of these exhibitions in any kind of documents, whether it's, I don't know, maybe you couldn't publish a critical article, but letters, or in the sphere of intellectuals. Is there any kind of way to gauge what the response of those, maybe not 300,000, but what the response of visitors was to these exhibitions?
Right, see, it's a great question. Reception, Victoria is struggling with this as well, is really hard under fascism, right? Because the press was censored. There is this diary archive in Umbria, and people go to the diaries to get a sense of reception. I had some clues in the soldier artist exhibition because it went to different locations, so I could read the reviews in Germany and in Hungary and Romania. I need to go to Bologna. I haven't looked in the archive of Bologna. I've only looked at the archive at Archivio Centrale in Rome. And I need to say there's a little bit of a sub-story of adventures in the archives around these two exhibitions because they're not well known. And the catalog, the German catalog that I had at the beginning here, I literally found by chance when I was a grad student at a book fair. And I was like, well, that's interesting. And I put it away for a number of years and then followed up and wrote about it. And the exhibition of National Socialism, there's almost nothing on it. There's a catalog in the Biblioteca di Storia Moderna e Contemporanea, but very little other, and then some correspondence in the Archivio Centrale. I would like to go to Bologna and look in the local papers and look at the archive of the Fiera di Bologna. John?
Thank you, Marla. I think towards the beginning, you mentioned like a magazine that was Berlin, Rome, Tokyo.
Yeah.
Was there, so along those lines, was there anything like this type of book pushing or exhibitions going to Japan or coming out of Japan, or was this a phenomenon only between the European Axis powers?
That's a great question. Well, the one during the war, it would have been very hard to, but there were joint conferences, joint publications, exchange of speakers. There was movement, particularly before, 1942.
With Japan?
Yeah, with Japan. Yeah.
Well, this is a Zoom question. Have you found evidence that there was a formal program within the Italian military to provide soldiers with art materials?
Ooh, great question. Wow, I have not found evidence of that. And again, the sort of serendipity, I did not know that artists were recruited and then asked to choose a battlefield until I gave this part of this talk somewhere, and someone wrote me and said, my grandfather was one of those artists who got a call at home and got to pick his battlefield. So, yeah. Interesting how we find ourselves. Because I don't think that's something they would have admitted. They made it sound in the official correspondence like these were great soldiers who happened to be artists and couldn't wait to contribute these images. Jessica?
Thank you, Marla. I'm sort of coming from a super ignorant point of view here, but it seems like there isn't much explored or spoken about in terms of the Japanese involvement with fascists and Nazis, and why do you think that is? Since so many people died and suffered on the other side of the world.
Well, there actually is a big movement to study transnational fascism. And I can give you some citations to articles about the fascist relationship in the Axis.
But there are articles, yeah. There's no real big book on it, or because we don't have it in Asia either.
Interesting, yeah. And, is there anything else on the Zoom? Tina?
Sorry to ask another question.
That's okay.
But I was, as someone who studies the history of technology, I was really interested in depictions of technological progress as like a tool of propaganda. And I was just wondering, so I know that the Soviets had a very successful and popular public science communication campaign. And I was wondering if the Italians had anything like that in the first half of the 20th century, and if that could have not inspired, but influenced the depictions of technology in these artifacts.
Yes, well, the regime was very pro-technology. It didn't always have the funding for it, but, radios were extremely important. And there was a program started already in the late 1920s to bring radios to villages. So yes, and that's the whole sort of reactionary modernism. On the one hand, harking back to ancient Rome, but on the other hand, embracing technology, particularly technologies that were useful for propaganda and war.
I have a question that might take you thinking about a coda to this. Do we continue to see this fervor for exhibitions in a different context with different aims clearly after the war ends? Does exhibition culture in Italy continue to flourish?
Great question. We know art exhibitions do, right? And the Biennale gets bigger and bigger and more important. I think these kind of topical exhibitions, which were such a constant in the fascist period, and there was everything, there was the exhibition of autarky and minerals and the Circus Maximus, where they took over the Circus Maximus and built this kind of fantasy world, to get to the earlier question, celebrating fascist technology and synthetic fuel and synthetic fabrics. So that it probably, and in the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, which kept getting reproduced all the way up to 1942, there was probably an association with fascism to those kinds of exhibitions. So I can't really think of any. There were the fairs, right, the Festa della Unità. So things were divided by your political, fairs were divided by your political position in a way. post-war.
Maybe the lack of kind of patron, the state motivation to do such a thing.
And the amount of money that was put into these things, continues to shock me. And in addition, Mussolini's office and the Ministry of Corporations and Ministry of National Education bought a number of these works. So they were still buying art in the middle of a losing war. Interesting. If you don't have a final question, I will thank you all for coming, and we can talk about